Hey guys, what's up? It's iFlynn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be covering one of the easiest loadouts in the game to recommend to newer players, simply because Saren as a Warframe or Saren Prime basically does everything. So a lot of players, they complain about, let's say, lacking in damage, lacking in survivability. Saren fixes a lot of those things because her abilities are basically centered around damage. One of them is centered around survivability, and then her stats, such as her health value, her armor value, etc., make it very easy to survive while playing this frame. So with all that in mind, Saren as a Warframe is a very good starting point to jump off from whenever you're recommending a Warframe to a newer player, because she basically fixes all of the problems that newer players have, right? So let's go ahead and talk about her abilities first so you get an idea of how this frame actually works. So her first ability is called Spores, and what happens here is we attach the spores to a certain enemy, then we go ahead and we shoot that enemy, and the spores will then spread to all of the enemies, dealing damage over time, scaling up in damage the longer the spores are attached to the enemies. You'll see that they also deal corrosive procs. So with the setup that I have, that's going to fully strip the enemy's armor. But for you, if you don't have the right things, then it's just going to reduce the enemy's armor. Either way, it makes the enemies easier to kill. Her second ability, Molt, allows you to basically leave like a little clone of yourself behind. And what this is going to do is it's going to strip you of negative status effects that are applied to you. So you see how I have radiation there. I press the second ability. The radiation is gone instantly. It also does toxin damage if the enemies are like around it. It's going to distract the enemies as well. So that's pretty cool. But we mainly use it to get rid of the negative status effects. Her third ability, Toxic Lash, is simply just a toxin damage buff. So it says, while active, attacks deal additional toxin damage. This effect is doubled for melee strikes, and it's instantly going to burst the spores when attacking afflicted enemies. So if the enemies have spores on them, it's basically going to make them explode, dealing additional damage, which is pretty cool. But we mainly care about that toxin damage buff. So that's going to look a little bit like this in practice. Let me just go ahead, spawn in some high-level enemies here. So 20 of them, and we're going to make them 205. I'm going to pause them just because spawn them in. Toxic Lash. Now, I don't have Toxin modded onto my primary weapon. It is Viral and Heat. So you see, Toxin procs are added. Then if I melee, Toxin procs are also added. So that's just going to add toxin damage to your weapon like it would if you were to throw on a toxin damage mod. Now, her fourth ability, Miasma, is unfortunately her weakest ability, and it's the one that we subsume off for this build. Although if you were to read the description, you'd think, wow, this ability seems really cool. Unfortunately, it just doesn't do like enough damage to really be worth keeping on. But this is Miasma, and it just applies a bunch of viral procs to enemies while dealing damage directly to them. So Saren's entire base kit looks a little bit like this. You would cast your spores on an enemy, make sure you have your Toxic Lash active, spread your spores around, then you would cast Miasma to add more viral procs to the enemies to just sort of scale your damage up and up and up. Ideally, you'd be going around killing the enemies as you see fit. And the more you kill the enemies, right? So let's say I kill an enemy that's standing over here, and then there's a room like right next to that enemy. Those spores are then going to spread into the next room. So your spores almost constantly stays up as long as you have enough range built into your Saren. So I've got two builds that I want to show you guys, one in config A and one in config B. They're two very different builds because one is a weapon platform build, then the other is a room sort of clearing nuking build, I guess you could say. But before we take a look at those, I want to talk about Saren's base stats, right? So her health is 465, shield is 370, armor is 315, energy is 300. This is a pretty nice spread of stats in every single category. This is actually one of the higher armor stats in the game. So if you're somebody who, let's say for example, like you don't like the whole like shield gaining thing and rolling guard, you could totally get away with just running the likes of vitality and adaptation to stay alive with this build. So the whole reason that I want to advertise Saren is because she's very flexible in how you can build her to stay alive and deal damage. The other thing as well, this energy value is also quite high at base 2. You don't necessarily need Prime Flow. Prime Flow is always a nice to have because that just increases the amount of energy that you have in your Warframe. but you're not going to be over investing in energy. Like, for example, you're not going to be wanting to equip blue shards to get more energy on this Warframe. And then another thing we can talk about as well is even her sprint speed stat. So Molt actually has this cool benefit of multiplying your speed as well. So if I were to go ahead and just sprint around a little bit, you can see how fast I'm running. But if I cast Molt, you can see that I go just that little bit quicker. So it's also going to help out for just getting missions done really fast. All right, moving on to the build. This is config A. This is a weapon platform build, which basically just translates to a damage buffing build. And I know that there's a lot of like different mods on here, but don't worry about the fact that I've got some prime mods on. You can sub them out for the regular versions of the mods and perform just fine. What really matters the most here is this augment called Venom Dose. What this does is it allows you to hold down the button where you're casting spores to then give yourself a corrosive damage buff. And that's going to equal the same amount of ability strength that you've got on. So you can see that I have 199% ability strength, and I've got 199% extra corrosive damage. So that's going to look a little bit like this. I hold down my 1 and it just, casts the ability. Top right hand corner, you can see the spore symbol, the duration, and the amount of damage that I'm getting from the buff. So this augment mod turns spores into a 2-in-1 ability. It's a room clearing ability where you're spreading, this thing that is just going to take down the enemy's health, and it's also a damage buff. So really good augment mod. So the main focus of the build is going to be increasing this ability strength value as much as we possibly can, while also keeping in mind things like our survivability and how long the abilities stay active for, right? So what I've went ahead and done is I've invested a lot into survivability because this is supposed to be a build that you're able to just look at, copy, take into the hardest content in the game, and just survive, right? So what you'll notice is I'm running basically 3 defensive mods. I'm running Catalyzing Shields, I'm running Rolling Guard, and I'm running Brief Respite. And that is going to enable you to take advantage of a mechanic called shield gating. And I know some people really dislike shield gating, but because Saren's base health and base armor is already super high, I don't feel the need to invest into the likes of Vitality and Adaptation because I feel like she's going to survive just fine in that base steel path content by just, taking direct damage to her health. By using the likes of Catalyzing Shields, Rolling Guard, and Brief Respite all comboed together, you have like this extra layer of defense. Now, if you are so super against, shield gating and Rolling Guard and stuff like that, you can simply just swap off Rolling Guard and Catalyzing Shields for Adaptation and Vitality. That would also allow you to swap out Brief Respite for something different in your aura slot too. I would recommend maybe Growing Power, but I really recommend just sticking with these 3 mods to keep you alive, especially if you have this arcane called Arcane Aegis. Now, because Saren is so good, we have this flexible arcane slot where I'm opting to put Arcane Aegis in here because it reads on shield damage, 3% chance for plus 30% shield recharge for 12 seconds. So this is just going to zoop your shield basically all the way back up, and it's going to aid in you staying alive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spawn in 5 corrupted heavy gunners here, and I'm just going to go ahead and let them shoot at me, and you can see how long I live for. So I'm going to unpause the AI, I'm going to jump into the middle of them and just check it out. I'm not dead. I'm still not dead. And we're not even taking advantage of the likes of Rolling Guard and stuff like that yet. So it did take me a while to die, but that's because of what we've got equipped. The Catalyzing Shields, the Arcane Aegis. We didn't take advantage of Brief Respite there. We didn't take advantage of Rolling Guard. So what happened there was Arcane Aegis and Catalyzing Shields were basically working together to keep me alive, right? So Catalyzing Shields actually reduces the amount of shields that we have. You can see that I'm all the way down to 74 shields now, but it gives us a longer shield gate window. So it says 1.33 seconds full shield gate immunity duration. And Arcane Aegis is just zipping our shield back up at a low percentage chance, mind you, but it did it quite frequently in that little test that we did, right? And that's just gonna keep us alive, right? Now, these two things combined together, very, very, very strong. But then Brief Respite is like another layer on top of that. So what this reads is, on ability cast, squad converts 150% of energy spent to shields while overshields are inactive, right? So if we pair Brief Respite with Blind Rage, this increases our ability strength, which is what we want because this is a damage buffing build, but it reduces our ability efficiency, making our abilities cost even more. So that kind of buffs up the effectiveness of Brief Respite. So what that means is that if I'm standing here with 74 shields and I cast my Molt ability, for example, you can see that I jump all the way up to 221 shields, right? So what that means is if you hit 0 shields, you just cast an ability and you have all of your shields back again, which means your shield gate is back up, which means you can't die. So the next concern that you might have is, Flynn, what if I don't have enough energy to cast my abilities? Well, that's not going to happen because you've got Equilibrium and you've got Prime Flow built directly into this build, right? So every single health orb is going to be an energy orb. Every energy orb is going to be a health orb. So that's going to aid in your survivability as well. Prime Flow is going to be there for more energy capacity, so you also have like a little stockpile of energy, and you somewhat want to be in the habit of keeping your abilities active, right? So you always want to keep your Spores active for that corrosive damage buff. You want to keep your Molt active because you're getting a speed buff from that. Also, this is a way to strip away those status effects, which Rolling Guard also does for you too. Then we have Toxic Lash. This is just a toxin damage buff, so you want to keep this on. And we subsumed Roar into Saren's 4th ability over Miasma, so you want to make sure that this is up at all times as well. Now, as you can see, I've got a lot of duration on this build, and that is basically just by design. Like, I want you guys to have all of your damage buff and abilities basically up at all times, which is why I opted for more duration over more strength. But if you wanted to flip it on its head and have more ability strength, you can absolutely drop Archon Continuity here because we're already going to be armor stripping with the Spores of Saren. There's really no need to have, Archon Continuity on. You can swap this off for Prime Continuity if you don't have the Archon version, or even just regular Continuity. It's entirely down to you, or like I said, more ability strength. Personally, I think that going for more strength than what we've got on this build is a little bit overkill because we are also running Molt Augmented here, which is another bonus 60% strength. So it's not like we are lacking in ability strength to buff up our damage buffs. And then the only other thing that you could swap off is Prime Surefooted. I recommend going ahead and just throwing on Pyre Drift if you have it, but you could realistically throw anything into this slot. I personally think that Prime Surefooted is kind of an overrated mod, especially if you're doing a really good job at killing a lot of enemies. This is only really going to be super necessary if you're going into like level cap content. And that's, it's just is what it is, because it's a mod that's locked behind 400 days login, so don't worry too much about this thing. For the Archon shards, I am rocking 4 Emerald shards, right? So I've got 2 normal, and this is just to increase the max stacks of corrosive that I can apply. This is going to allow me to full strip the enemies, so this is what's going to allow me to easily go into like level cap content because the enemy's armor is going to be fully stripped away. But again, if you're just getting into the game, like if you're just shooting for Steel Path, you don't have to worry about having these 2 basic Emerald shards on because Saren is going to perform just fine. The other 2, which are Talforge, which is just the upgraded versions, these are just going to give me more toxin status effects damage, so that's just helping out with my overall damage output. Again, you don't need these. And we have the Amber Archon shard on here, which is going to help with my casting speed. Again, totally not needed. I'm going to be rocking the Excelter Prime for this demonstration of killing the enemies, simply because it's a fun weapon. It can kill a lot of like lower level enemies, but it doesn't really excel, that was a bad pun, at killing the higher level enemies, right? So I'm rocking a build that looks like this with Viral, Heat, Primary, Merciless. So it's not the most damaging gun in the game, but I'm going to spawn in the Eximus Heavy Gunners here. So they look like this. 205 Steel Path modifier. And I'm going to pause them. I can't be asked dealing with, them running around. But turn on my buffs. So my Spores, Corrosive. I've got my Toxic Lash. I'm going to cast my Roar like so. I'm just going to aim at the enemy's head here. And you can see that we deal a pretty significant amount of damage to the enemies, right? Like they die really, really, really fast. And that's kind of the entire point of this build, right? Like, it's to enable you to use any weapon that you want with this Warframe. So here's the AX52. I'm rocking a build that looks like this. I probably need to swap out that beam mod there because I'm not fighting against Grenier. But if I go ahead, spawn the enemies in again, cast my abilities, my 4, there we go, shooting at the head, you can see that we get a pretty significant damage buff because of all the damage buffs that we're rocking. So this is basically just your, I want to play Warframe, I want to shoot stuff, and I want to stay alive builds. This is what you rock. All of the ability strength and all of the defensive mods make for a extremely easy passive playstyle where just as you're jumping around, just as you're recasting your abilities and stuff like that, you're staying on top of your survivability, you're refreshing your shield kit, you're stripping away status effects by using rolling guard and molt. So it's all sort of like autopilot survival. And then you also get to kind of autopilot the loadout that you're rocking as well, because we have so much ability strength and so many different damage buffing abilities, giving us really effective actual elemental damage buffs, right? That you can be lazy with your primary, secondary, and melee builds and still participate in 99% of the content. So that's your damage buffing build. You'll probably figure out that, you know, your spores spreading isn't super effective because we have very low range, but that's what config B is going to fix. This is basically an entirely different build. We're missing out on a few things such as our duration here, but we have basically the exact same amount of strength and we have a lot more range. So all that's really different is you need to be recasting your roar, toxic lash, your molt, and your damage buff and your spores more often, right? Which is okay because we're using brief respite, remember? So every single time we're casting an ability, we are refreshing our shield kit and keeping ourselves alive. Now you could drop prime flow on this build to get yourself a little bit more duration, but I personally wouldn't recommend it because having that energy just in storage is far more worth it than having that little bit of duration, because like I said, you need to be casting those abilities to keep brief respite up. Now, because we're going to be casting more frequently, what I've done is I've opted to drop off Arcane Aegis, which means a little bit less survivability, but I've thrown on Arcane Energize, and this is just going to help keep our energy topped off, and trust me, you will be able to survive with this build. Everything that you're doing for your survivability is totally passive. As long as you're playing the game, you will live. So now this build looks a little bit like this. You'll cast your 1 for your damage buff, you'll cast your 3 for your damage buff, your 4 for your damage buff, then you'll cast your spores on the enemy, you'll shoot at them, and they will spread, and you can see the amount of damage that we're dealing and the fact that the enemy's armor is being stripped. So this is an extremely efficient build for just racking up a ton of kills. So I'm here in a conjunction survival, and what I aim to show you guys is just how autopilot this entire build is. So I'm going to start off by casting Roar. I'm going to cast my damage buff on my spores. Just going to jump around, kill some enemies, wait for an energy orb or 2 to drop. I've got 1. Now I'm going to cast spores on an enemy here. It's going to start to spread. See 8 infected. And that number, the amount that's infected, it's always going to change based on, you know, how many enemies are close to you. But you can see even with the amount of range that we have on, which wasn't max range, by the way, the spores are still staying stuck to the enemies pretty consistently, right? So you'll also notice that as I'm just like jumping around, rolling around, casting abilities, etc., I'm refreshing my shield kit and maybe proccing rolling guard on a roll, etc., etc. And that's just keeping me alive. So anytime that I feel my shields go down, I get like the little flicker on the screen, or I literally see the bar, the pleat. I'm just hitting molt. I'm recasting Roar, recasting Toxic Lash, whatever, to refresh that duration. And you can even recast spores in the enemy as well if you want to spread to more enemies, right? It's totally down to you. If you recast spores on an enemy, it's going to half the amount of damage that you're currently dealing. But as you can see, that doesn't matter much. So you've got the damage buff, you got the room clearing, You basically got everything. You've got the passive survivability. Like, you're good. You're surviving. You're killing all the enemies. You can rooms, damage buffs, etc. Like, this is just such an easy build to use. But anyway, guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead, hit like. If you want to see more Warframe content from me, hit subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.